Thank you all for coming. This is great. A warning, I know a few of you were at the Prairie Lights reading. I hope I'm not repeating myself entirely. Some of it may be a little familiar, but I've tried to introduce some other material and kind of weave it together a bit differently. Here's the plan. This is a very long book, as you may have noticed. Anne says it's about 1,000 pages. That's not true. It's over 800, yeah, right. But that includes photographs, and it includes an index, it's all text, right? It's a very long book. But it's a very long book that's been in the works for a very long time. I started this project in 2000, the fall of 2000, and it's just done. So it took a while, but I hope you'll understand as I proceed why this might have been a project that required a bit of time to be in the cooker for it to achieve its proper aroma. So I'm going to talk about several things, but and then I want to leave time for questions and comments from all of you, because I'm very interested in your thoughts and reactions to all of this. I'm going to talk a bit about how I got started on this and why it took the shape it did. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the kinds of conditions of urban life in the late 19th and early 20th century that really were the kind of precipitant for a kind of new thinking about what cities could be like and how they could be better managed. And some of it is, some of the detail, it's over 100 years ago, but not that long ago. It's pretty shocking to our sensibilities. This, in many ways, seems like a very different world than the one we inhabit. And I would argue that that's true, and it's true in part because of the way that working people, immigrants, migrants, the cities, responded to the conditions that they faced and the kind of solutions that they came up with for how to make life better, to be both, to make cities more habitable, but also more democratic, because the cities were not particularly democratic at the turn of the century. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about a couple of the main characters among a pretty large cast of characters who appear in this novel. A novel. Did I say novel? No, it's not a novel. I didn't make this up. somebody, yeah, right. No, somebody kept referring to a novel. Planted that idea in my head. No, it's not a novel. It's evidence-based, right? But these are two of the characters that I came across in the course of the research that really fascinated me, and for a couple of specific reasons that I'll try to make clear. E.R. Hartley from Bradford in West Yorkshire, England, was a master butcher by trade, and I'll describe some of the conditions in Bradford in a bit, but he became very determined to try to run for political office, to try to change the horrific conditions that he saw around him. And he was very determined. He lost about 3 straight elections and eventually was elected. And then he became a rather contentious presence in the city council of Bradford. He kept a pretty good record of what he did and how he proceeded with his activity. At some point in his career, and he was elected, I think, first in 1895, served in the city council pretty continuously after that. But by 1910, 1911, he was just exhausted by the whole prospect of what he had been trying to work on and just needed a respite. So what did he do? He got on a boat and headed for Australia and New Zealand for what he called a recuperative holiday. But for E.R. Hartley, a recuperative holiday meant that once he landed and people got to know him, he immediately became involved in municipal issues in cities across Australia and New Zealand. He was going there initially for about a year. It's a long trip, so you don't just buzz over there and come right back. But he ended up staying for almost 2 years because he was in such demand as a speaker. And he did eventually come back to the UK. Jimmy Thorne, Jimmy he was called, from Christchurch, New Zealand, was a young man. He was a railway shop worker in Christchurch. And he became very involved in local municipal politics and municipal issues, and was a very determined, this is a later photograph, so it doesn't really convey his youthfulness at the time, but he became very enmeshed in the local political scene, and finally one of his mentors said, you really need to get out of New Zealand for a while and go see the world and kind of engage with people elsewhere. And so he got on a boat and headed for England. And it turns out that E.R. Hartley and Jimmy Thorne crossed paths as part of a kind of agitational circuit that they both were involved in. And so Jim Thorne stayed for 4 years in the UK, organizing for the Independent Labour Party, first in London and then in Scotland. And he brought back with him all this kind of experience of speaking and of agitating, and he put it to work back in New Zealand as a much more seasoned and mature activist. So these are two characters that are interesting for a variety of reasons. They both come from the working class. They both get very involved in city politics. And they both have a kind of international vision. It's not enough to just work in your own backyard, but it was important to them to connect with people elsewhere who were doing similar kind of work. And so they did. And I don't know that they ever became friends or colleagues. There's no evidence of that. But they certainly were aware of each other, and they certainly, indirectly at least, learned from each other. So I'll say a bit more about them in a bit. But now I want to just say a few things about why I got into this project in the first place. On a personal level, I've had a long interest in working class politics in cities. And it always has struck me, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, that it was a very kind of experimental and kind of innovative period in which people were looking around for new kinds of ways to engage politically. And it was really in cities, in my view, that much of that engagement really took hold. Some of it was in the aftermath of big strikes. In the 1890s, it was a period of large-scale strikes around the world. There was a worldwide depression from the early 90s to much of the decade, really. And so in places like Manningham Mills in Manchester, in Bradford, and in Broken Hill, New South Wales, one of my favorite places of all in this research. Strikes really precipitated a kind of new thinking about politics and about what to do about cities. And what they discovered, among other things, was that no matter where you looked in cities, there was a set of conditions that were quite comparable. There was very old and decrepit housing and overcrowding. There was terrible sewerage. There was rampant epidemic disease. There were high levels of unemployment. And basically, cities weren't providing much in the way of services. Most people didn't have baths in their own homes. And so the demand for public baths, a place where you could go and get clean, was a very fundamental demand. And so they began to turn to politics to try to remedy some of these problems. Just pull up another slide here. Not getting a response here. There we go. So the photography in this period, the documentary photography of urban living conditions, is quite widespread, and so from country to country, it's possible to find pretty amazing photographs that document the urban living conditions that people face. And as I proceeded with this research, it took me to Broken Hill, among other places. It took me to the Grey Mining District in the South Island of New Zealand, to bustling and diverse industrial towns in the north of England, in West Yorkshire, to Christchurch and Dunedin in New Zealand, Malmo and Växjö in Sweden, Bielefeld, Stuttgart, and many other towns in Germany, and closer to home to Milwaukee and to places like Hamilton and Dayton, Ohio, where it turns out there are pretty interesting stories to be uncovered. I also did a fair amount of work on larger cities, on Cleveland and New York and Amsterdam and Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Stockholm, Sydney, places that were wonderful to visit, but I was working, so I didn't get to see the sites particularly. It's time to go back. I want to mention, however, that on many of these research trips, Anne Stromquist was with me, not only as a companion, but as a research assistant, and she did a lot of the work helping me photograph documents that I could then bring back in my computer and digest at a more leisurely pace. And without her, this project would, in a lot of ways, been unimaginable. But I've been convinced for a long time that local study, looking at local places, is really important. And that it's there that you can kind of grapple with the human dimension of history. Where people come alive, they're real. And they're varied, and it's in cities very often that people feel some agency, some ability to kind of make a difference. And so it's always been fascinating to me to take local places as a kind of site for investigation. And cities in this period are growing by leaps and bounds. The massive migration from the countryside, but also immigration from abroad, is populating cities with people who are basically newcomers to urban life, many of them. And they're confronting living conditions that are, in many cases, horrific. But cities were also marked by long traditions, and by long, I mean centuries-long traditions of elite governance. They were not democratic. The municipal franchise was highly restrictive in terms of who could vote, based on property and based on income in many cases. And so a very small proportion of the working class in cities around the world actually were able to vote. And so that, among other things, posed a real challenge for movements that were seeking to generate social change, when much of their electoral base was in fact unable to make their voices heard. So the traditions of elite governance in cities was very long-standing, and among other things, city councils met during the day and not at night. And so one of the first demands that workers made when they began to get elected to office was, let's meet at night when we can actually come to meetings, because we can't come during the days. Unlike businessmen and lawyers and other members of the local elite who can, take time off and come and do the governing business, we can't. So at a very basic level, it took a kind of reconstruction of urban governance and politics in order to make a difference. One of the things that I was struck by in doing the research was the shock and trauma that ordinary people face in day-to-day life in cities. There were cities like Melbourne in Australia that had a reputation as marvelous Melbourne, as it was called in the 1880s. But it turns out that despite its reputation, it was more popularly known as Smellville. And as one commentator noted, it was wallowing in its own filth. Sickness and death became a hideous reminder of the fundamental interdependence of social areas of the metropolis. However, as in many cities, the ratepayers, the taxpayers, property holders, were wary about increased taxation and were reluctant to see anything significant done to remedy these conditions that might lead to higher municipal expenditures. One of the suburban industrial suburbs in Melbourne was called Footscray, and it was known as Stinkopolis locally. Its city council liberally dispensed licenses to, quote, driven out capitalists from other industrial suburbs who operated bone mills, manure works, and boiling down places. They were the most notorious of the newcomers. The inspector of nuisances, so there was actually an inspector of nuisances in the city, was at one point in 1887 told that he was sending too many reports about conditions in the city, and he ought to cease doing that. So one of the most colorful passages comes from a local newspaper called the Footscray Independent. So these were housing conditions in that period in Melbourne. It was typical in these cities for there to be backyards with privies, and that human waste was very unsatisfactorily disposed of. But in Melbourne, this Footscray Independent published an article called Out in a Gondola, and I just want to read you a short passage from it. Let's see if I can get the light on the. So it was a bright, sunshiny morning when we sailed away in a gallant bark over the odoriferous surface of the saltwater river. Above the railway bridge, pieces of rancid fat, haunches, lights, dead lambs, dogs, etc. line the shores. They are burrowed in all directions with the holes of water rats. The gut factory pours in a stream of excrement and gut scrapings. Next, the glue works swamp the shore with hair and parings from hides, and a large pile on the shore has accumulated for the rats, ready for removal or being swept into the river when convenient. At about 50 feet from the bank opposite this drain, an oar could be pushed down for several feet in the accumulated deposit of decaying putrescence, as the writer of the language. Even at high water mark, the keel of the boat raised a trail of blood, showing how great the deposit was. And so this is not entirely unique. These were conditions that residents had to live around and in. Bradford, which was a well-known industrial manufacturing town, woolen manufacturing in West Yorkshire, and became a real hub of this new labor politics as it emerged. The slopes of the town came down into a valley where the heart of the factory employment was, and former outworkers, people who worked in the cottages in their homes, would come down by foot into that valley to work in the mills. F.W. Jowett, who later became, who was a city councilor and later a member of Parliament, a very prominent member of Parliament, recalled the social conditions in Bradford when he was elected to the town council in 1892 as a socialist and independent labor representative. The houses in which a very large portion, if not the majority of the working people lived, were like the one in which I was born 28 years before. One room upstairs, one downstairs, and a windowless cellar. The houses were in long streets intersected by passages with privy middens for each block of houses in the backyards. All these houses were built back to back, and therefore they had no through draft for ventilation. Employment, mostly for women and children, was at low wages. Men's work was scarce and irregular, and unemployment among them was chronic. No old age pensions or unemployment insurance, no school meals for half-starved children, no school clinics. The dreaded workhouse, still commonly referred to by the people of the working class as the Bastille, was regarded as such. The terrible disease of anthrax, the wool sorters disease as it was called, was well known by that name. Slums and cellar dwellings, poverty and poverty diseases rampant. And so those were the conditions that Jowett, who later came to try to do something about these conditions as a councillor and then as a member of Parliament, grew up among. Hamburg, Germany, was an old Hanseatic League city, but in the late 19th century was enormously expanded by outmigration into the city. And so living conditions deteriorated very rapidly there as well. And again, there are documentary photographs that help us understand and see the conditions that were right. Hamburg's workers faced rising poverty, growing congestion, a lack of affordable housing, and a tax structure that bore most heavily on the poorest consumers. Compounding these problems were massive environmental degradation and deteriorating public health conditions, highlighted by the catastrophic cholera epidemic of 1892. Chronic problems of human and animal waste, impure water supplies, air pollution, dust, lack of access to pure food increased massively after the 1880s with rapid population growth. Visitors to Hamburg spoke of viewing the city as if through a veil of smoke. I guess we get a little bit of that feeling these days with our Canadian smoke descending on us, but nothing like the conditions that people faced there. And the Citizens Club noted that even in the 1870s, in the outlying impoverished district of Billwerder Ausschlag, citizens had to wade through a morass in a major thoroughfare that consisted of sewage, animal waste, and garbage. And so, I'm tempted to take you on a tour from city to city, but essentially the conditions are quite similar and similarly documented from one city to another. In Homestead, Pennsylvania, for instance, American cities were newer, and in some respects, somewhat free of the worst of the problems that you might see in European cities, or in cities in Australia and New Zealand, for that matter. But the conditions were not altogether different, and Homestead was the seat of the Carnegie Steelworks, the major steelworks in this period that Andrew Carnegie had established and that was widely known. Homestead's water supply was drawn from the Monongahela, polluted by sewage from numerous towns and villages, as well as industrial wastes and acid discharges from mines. Individuals sunk wells, but these were frequently contaminated by seepage from privy vaults. Margaret Byington was part of something called the Pittsburgh Survey that was conducted early in the 20th century to try to document these conditions. And she wrote a particularly compelling book within this survey project called homestead households of a mill town. She studied 21 courts in this community where yards and toilets and water supply are used in common. As she wrote, in these courts lived 239 families. 168 were Slovaks, 22 Hungarians, 16 Russians, 10 Poles, 23 Slavs, and others of other origin. 102 were lodgers. 51 families, including sometimes 4 or 5 people, lived in one-room tenements. One half of the families used their kitchens as sleeping rooms. Only 3 houses had running water, and in at least 3 instances, over 110 people were dependent on 1-yard hydrant for water. One of the best-known documentary photographers of this period was Jacob Riis, a name some of you may know of from a very powerful book that he wrote called How the Other Half Lives. But initially, Jacob Riis, he was a Danish immigrant journalist, and he began to use the camera. This was a whole new enterprise in the 1880s for him. He'd never used the camera before. He began to prowl around to try to document some of the conditions in New York tenements that he had encountered as a journalist, often accompanying the police on raids to these quarters. I'm going to keep track of the time here, which I want to forget. But Riis took these photographs, and the method of photography was really quite dramatic. He would sometimes sneak in to tenements like this in the middle of the night. He had a camera. He had to set up the camera, glass plate, taking glass plate negative. So he had to put the glass plate in. He had a frying pan with magnesium powder, and he poured alcohol into the frying pan and then lit it. And while it was blazing, illuminating the room, he took the photograph. And so this was an example, called it the Bayard Street Tenement, New York City, circa 1890. Riis is famous, legitimately famous for the quality and the kind of starkness of his photographs. Jersey Street Courtyard in New York City in 1890. Again, like Hamburg, like Melbourne, these backyards with outhouses that were used by multiple families in a tenement. I could talk about Wellington, New Zealand, but I think I've made my point. Conditions that were shocking. So the shock of these living conditions, then, it seems to me, is an important touchstone for what I'm trying to do in this book, which is to show how workers responded and what they attempted to do to remedy these conditions. It required a lot of research in local sources, minute books of local unions and of local political parties, city council minutes. You don't think of city council minutes as being very lively reading for the most part. But if you know who the players are, you can kind of figure out what's going on, and it turns out to be very revealing and very interesting. So the focus of the book is really 1890 to 1925. And when I submitted the manuscript to the publisher, after they had accepted it, which I was grateful for, their first question was, well, what about a second volume? And I said, well, how about an epilogue to this volume? And so, one could write a second volume if one had enough life and enough energy to do it. But that's not for me. Somebody else can do that. But I did write an epilogue. And the epilogue tries to carry the story forward in the 20th century into the 21st century. And it can only do so in a very cursory way, but it did seem to me important to kind of make a connection between this period and more modern times. I'm going to skip some things here. This was, in addition to taking note, and it got to be pretty obvious that the conditions that these movements were facing from one city to another were really quite similar. And it wasn't surprising that they began to respond to these conditions in quite similar ways, focusing particularly on municipal politics as the most accessible arena in which they can make themselves felt, and where it might actually make a difference. But the other thing that struck me, not only were these conditions comparable, but these local activists were internationalists. They saw themselves as part of a larger worldwide movement. And, Jim Thorne and E.R. Hartley are kind of exemplary of that. But they're not alone. These political activists traveled across borders. They compared notes. They read each other's programs and platforms. They copied each other's methods. This is a municipal platform from, again, one of my favorite places, Broken Hill, New South Wales. Broken Hill is called Broken Hill because it's a silver mining town deep in the outback of New South Wales. It took me 2 days driving 12 hours a day from Melbourne to get to Broken Hill. And it's a broken hill because it's a mine. They in order to mine the silver, they had to break the hill. But it very early on became a hub of this kind of new politics. And in 1900, workers elected a city council of their own members. And from that day forward until the present, it's been governed as a labor party and municipal socialist city. But there were other characters who appeared and who were important to the story. Again, this is from Australia, two, at the time, young women, both from Melbourne. Lillian Locke was a labor organizer, organizing women, but also a women's suffragist. And this photograph was taken in about 1905. Vida Goldstein was a journalist and women's rights advocate, also in Melbourne. They were friends, but they also had pretty significant political differences, and that's a whole story unto itself. But they were exemplary of the way in which suffrage, the fight for suffrage, women's and municipal suffrage, was intertwined with labor issues and these urban issues that I've been talking about. I'm cutting as I'm going here. Here's, Lindsay, here's where I use my pointer. So this is a map that I created out of, it's a county level map showing all the counties in the country. And these are the cities that I've been able to determine were at one point or another governed by local socialists. Now, some of these cities, like Milwaukee, I tried to make a bigger dot to indicate that this was not just 1 year, but it was multiple years of local governance. In Manitowoc, Wisconsin, if you'll notice, it's a little hard to discern the outline of Ohio, but Ohio was very significantly, its municipalities had a very significant municipal socialist presence. And in Ohio, there were at least 29 different cities that had socialist administrations between 1911 and 1920. Milwaukee, of course, is the best known case of socialist local governance, but Schenectady and Reading, Pennsylvania, Flint, Minneapolis, Davenport, Iowa, Newcastle, Indiana, Columbus, Ohio, Bridgeport, Connecticut, were other fairly large cities that had socialist governments at one point. Many of these socialist governments were short-lived. And why were they short-lived? They were short-lived in part because of fusion. Anybody know what fusion is? It's where the opposing parties, Republicans and Democrats, got together and formed a temporary party in order to defeat the socialists who had been elected to govern the city. And it was almost invariably successful. Sometimes the Republicans and Democrats couldn't get together, right? And they each wanted to run their own candidate. And if they did, then the socialist government might continue for a few more years. But eventually, most times, they saw the light and made temporary peace. Socialist governments at the city level were hamstrung by state preemption. Home rule was an issue during these days, and something that we know something about in Iowa today. The state coming in and saying, "Oh no, cities can't do that. Only states can do that," and not allowing socialist administrations in these cities to really, exercise more power over things like taxation or municipal housing or municipalizing streetcars. That was a big battle in Ohio. But I wanted to come back again to E.R. Hartley and just convey a little bit more about his, about his time as a city councilman. Hartley, unusually, he was a very busy man, as you'll see, but Hartley kept a daily diary for 1 year in 1900 of what all he was up to. And if I can find the right page number, it was a pretty remarkable record. So the date is Monday, 26th of March, 1900. This is his writing, abbreviated writing in his diary. Sewage at 10:30, followed by finance at 11:30, lasting until nearly 1 o'clock. Trams at 4:30, then straight to school board attendance, followed by a board meeting of the Fair Contract Committee. Spoke for half an hour at Chloe's school on behalf of J.W. Waterhouse. Was tired out. And, after a hard-fought election the next year, which he won by an even larger majority, he took stock of the toll the busy year had taken on his health and financial condition. He'd given 92 lectures and speeches, attended 200 committees, council, and board meetings. Early in the year, was in more bed than out with bronchitis. Delegations from the ILP and the Bradford Moore Ward rebuffed his efforts to retire from public work. They promised to raise money to clear his debts and replace the income he lost through inattention to his butcher business. Hartley was a kind of contentious guy in city council, right? He was going to fight for the things that he felt strongly about. One of the big fights he had was when the city council wanted to raise the salaries of a whole set of city administrators, but not give any increase to the men at very low wages who collected night soil. And so Hartley got on his horse and started fighting that battle. He also, at times, had a sense of humor. It comes through the diary. He said at one point in an intense debate where one of his opponents was kind of getting riled up, and he said to the aside, he said, "I think he must have sat in my chair because of the way he was so intensely engaged." So these socialists were also pragmatists, and I talked about F.W. Jowett before. He wrote in 1907, "As socialists, we might still aspire to, quote, establish a socialist city where there will be bread for all, work for all, and no fireless grates. But the toll taken on the stunted victims themselves necessitated a more practical, if circuitous path forward. The socialist must needs work his passage to the socialist city by means of municipal trading, housing reform, municipal milk supply, and education. And so in a real sense, these were practical politicians who were trying to navigate, often as a small minority, the passage of improvements that would make a qualitative difference in people's lives. Some of the other characters in Germany were first and foremost a man named Hugo Lindemann, who from Stuttgart in 1911 decided to run for mayor of the city, Oberbürgermeister, and came within a hair's breadth of winning in a major German city. And there were other cases where there was evidence in the pre-war years of these political activists gaining considerable influence beyond their kind of small minority status. In Hamilton, Ohio, the socialist vote jumped from 5% to 29% in 2 years between 1908 and 1910. An organizer reported that the socialist headquarters went from being a lamppost on High Street to a comfortable downtown hall, and sort of indicative of the growing support that they had. But there's also a dimension to this story that I think is particularly important, and that is to convey the sense in which this was a cultural movement. This wasn't just a political movement. So in West Yorkshire, for instance, they organized cycling clubs and labor choirs and labor churches and did a lot of street speaking and had May Day celebrations that fed what one commentator called the spirit of socialist revivalism. A Nottingham worker recalled, "Those were glad, creative days. Even those of us who lived through them did not realize how happy and privileged we were. Arid-minded highbrows thought it was trivial. The politically orthodox disliked it. Socialist doctrinaires declared that its economic basis was not sound. But the man on the street accepted its teachings, to which he gave the intense fervor of a happy convert." And one of my favorite passages, again, a recollection. This is another photo. This is a more contemporary photograph of Jimmy Thorne, our New Zealander, who ended up in England organizing for the Independent Labour Party for 4 years. But one of my favorite passages describes a very popular woman ILP speaker named Carolyn Martin, and this observer recalled the impact that her speech had on him. He wrote, I knew nothing of the subject of socialism and did not care to learn much about it. But for curiosity's sake, I took my seat on a tree stump that Friday evening when Caroline Martin came to Eagly to speak in the open air. In company with some 200 or 300 people, I listened to an exposition of socialistic principles, illustrated and interspersed with the sayings and doings of the carpenter of Nazareth. My wonder at what seemed to me the intrepidity and courage of a young and defenseless woman grew and changed to amazement at myself that I'd never seen these things in this light before. She had spoken as no woman ever spoke before in my hearing. Scales fell from my eyes, and ere long, I was a socialist. So this sense of a conversion experience comes through the documentation very powerfully. About a third of the book, I'm looking for my watch here. Let me line this up. About a third of the book actually deals with the World War I period. And there's a lot in that part of the book that I think is really interesting and I think maybe important, because it illustrates the way in which cities, in the context of war, became kind of laboratories for a kind of rejuvenation of this new politics. And in the context of war and the conditions precipitated by war, workers had a certain kind of desperation and began not only to think anew about the war itself, but also about the conditions under which they had to live. One of the outcomes of the war was most dramatically unfolded in Vienna, Austria. Vienna had been a site of much of this same kind of new working class politics that I've been describing, but always as a kind of small minority. And these were two of the most active city councilors in Vienna. Franz Schumacher, who tragically was assassinated in 1913, a year before the war, by a political opponent. And then Jakob Reumann, who was a Vienna city councilor and became the first socialist mayor of Vienna in 1919 at the end of the war. The achievements of what came to be known as Red Vienna between 1919 and 1934, when Nazi sympathizers overwhelmed the city government and basically took control. I mean, it's a complicated story, but that's in essence what happened. The socialists were driven from office after about 15 years. But during that time, in Vienna, they had made major transformations in the daily life of workers, not the least in terms of housing. And so this new housing complex that was developed in that period, this is a more contemporary photograph, but it's called Gemeinde Wien, the community of Vienna. And it is called Jakob, you can't see it probably, Reumannhof. So it was named for this socialist mayor. And I don't know if any of you who saw the New York Times on the 28th of May, just this last May, saw the article called The Renter's Utopia, which was a very interesting account of contemporary, now, public housing in Vienna that is directly linked to these developments under Red Vienna. Today in Vienna, about half of the population rents from the city, public housing. They sign contracts under which they will never pay more than 8% of their incomes for rent. And those contracts hold no matter what happens to their income. And these are accommodations that are really quite stunning. In Reumannhof, you can't see this, but this is the swimming pool or the bathing facility in Reumannhof that was developed in this period and continues to this day. And so there is a kind of legacy of this socialist governance in Vienna that has survived. And it has made quite a dramatic difference in people's lives. Let me end with another quote. This is from the Australian Worker in 1925. So these are Australians writing about Red Vienna. And what they wrote was, "The socialist most hated in Vienna by the well-to-do is certainly Hugo Breitner." Hugo Breitner? Who's Hugo Breitner? Speak to them of Lenin, Trotsky, or Liebknecht, and they will listen with perfect calm. But mention the name of Breitner, and the calm is replaced by fury and hate. He is credited with the intention of destroying the whole economic life of Vienna. In reality, he is merely the author of the financial policy of the Municipal Council. Breitner's new tax scheme introduced 18 new taxes, which chiefly hit those who can afford to pay, and abolishes 1 or 2 old taxes, which burden the workers unfairly. So, key to these developments was the ability of Vienna to control its own tax structure. And that came as a result of constitutional changes in 1919 at the end of the war. What I would leave you with, I guess, is to think about the ways in which, in our own cities, there is a kind of legacy of this politics which we often take for granted or don't think of in those terms. We enjoy thinking about those photographs from cities at the turn of the century. We enjoy public water and sewerage, public street repair and maintenance, garbage collection, public transit, schools, municipal social welfare, libraries, public space, parks and swimming pools, open to the public housing to some degree, public health services, and public, not private, police, who are accountable to those who elect the city administration. And so in a certain sense, I think, even though it's a convoluted story politically in the 20th century, there is a certain sense, particularly when we compare the cities we live in today with the conditions of those years, in which we've inherited something from the city politics of those times, and from the struggles that people like Hartley and Thorne undertook to try to make cities more livable and more democratic. So let me stop there, and I would welcome any questions, comments, thoughts you have about this material. I invite you to read the book, but if you can do it without having to buy it, that would be good. Because it's a long book, and it's in a hardback, it's an expensive book, but Prairie Lights is offering this. Anyway, I'd be happy to hear any questions you have. Yeah?
I just wanted to make an announcement that Shell, if you want to hear more about Shell's research, he's going to be teaching a senior college course this fall in November. And so the registration is in late August, so look forward to seeing that.
We'll be in the Coralville Center for the Performing Arts. Do I have to perform?
Yes.
In that I forget what we ended up naming it. Maybe it's Why Cities Matter. It could be the same title. Yeah, something along those lines. It starts in mid-October and it sort of runs for 4 consecutive weeks. But I'd be happy to have any enroll. Yes, ma'am.
Joe, at the end, the 2 gentlemen from Vienna, the councilman,
Yeah.
Otto Kring and
Otto Kring.
Favorite.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, those are the wards that they came from.
Okay.
These are kind of neighborhoods in Vienna.
Okay.
Otterkring and Favorite were 2 very densely inhabited working class wards, and these were very, very prominent. They were both workers. One was a locksmith, one was a textile worker, elected to political office.
I thought maybe they were titles or something.
Pardon me? Oh, no. Yeah, those are neighborhoods. Yeah. Yes?
In the cartoon from Broken Hill,
Oh, yeah.
for the miners' strike,
Yeah.
all I could see were women.
Yes, right.
What was going on there?
Well, as often happened in big strikes, women took a very active and sometimes quite aggressive role in the strikes. Sometimes it was because they weren't as directly vulnerable as men might have been for that kind of public action. If you were identified as a worker in your name, you could, for a particular firm that was on strike, you could be blacklisted, or you could be. But so women were, in a certain sense, they weren't insulated because obviously families of male workers or women workers who were on strike were vulnerable, but they had a certain freedom, but also a tradition of public activism. I mean, these crowd actions by women in England go back into the 18th and even 17th century. And often it was around issues of bread and food. but they were quite public. And so in Cleveland, I didn't show this slide, but there was a streetcar strike in 1899. And again, streetcar strikes around the world were often precipitating events for local political mobilization. But this was a very nasty streetcar strike in 1899 that went on for months. But one of the strikers' tactics was when riders on the scab streetcars got off in a neighborhood that was predominantly working class, women would follow that person into a shop, and if they were able to purchase something in the shop, the women then told the shopkeeper that if he continued to serve riders on these scab streetcars, that they would be boycotted. And so women, again, took the lead in sort of enforcing the prohibition against riding on streetcars that were being struck. So yeah, and you know, one of the things I couldn't really talk about because of time in any detail was the actual direct political involvement that women had in municipal politics. It wasn't unusual for women to win the vote first in school board elections or in municipal elections before they got a parliamentary vote or a national suffrage. And so, so there were many women who were quite active in local politics even before they were able to win the vote nationally in their respective countries. Yeah, Jane.
On your map that you made of the various municipalities that had socialist governments during that time period, I was curious to look at Utah. Salt Lake City, was that like a big center of socialism?
You know, I'd have to look at my notes to remember exactly which towns. There were a number of railroad towns in Utah, sort of smaller outlying towns outside of Salt Lake that had socialist administrations that went on for more than one election.
I just think of it as being completely Mormon dominated.
Oh.
No?
No. I mean, yeah, I mean, or if yes, then there were also workers in those communities who either despite or perhaps even because of their Mormon faith, were energized politically and became active. No, I mean, throughout, you know, certain pockets in the West, in Colorado and Utah, even in Idaho, and certainly in Washington State, and there were real concentrations of socialist success.
And zero in Texas.
Pardon me?
Zero.
And zero in Texas that we've been able to identify, right? This is preliminary. There is always new territory to be covered here. Because a lot of it has to be done in local sources. You know, this is not stuff that's being reported in the national press necessarily. And so it takes a lot of digging to find these figures. Any others?
I have a question.
Yes.
If you were to do the second part of would you come up to how municipalities are doing in the current situation we have?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think some of the same issues are still very salient today. I mean, the most obvious one is home rule. And this was a battle that was continually fought in the period that I've been looking at. But, you know, the claim, among other claims, to be able to govern yourself and to set your own rules and regulations. I mean, you know, we have a county government who, not too many years ago, decided to set a county-wide minimum wage. And the state came in and said, you can't do that. Cities can't do that. I mean, it turns out that constitutionally it's true. Cities can only do what state governments allow them to do. But the fact is that there certainly have been periods in which state governments have been much more lenient in terms of allowing cities to exercise their self-governance to a greater degree. And that was certainly true, not everywhere, but in many states, in this period, 1898 to 1922. There was a kind of robust pushback on the part of cities, and in some states, they were allowed to have more latitude to do that. But you know, there's a strong push today to privatize municipal services. Public employees are under the gun in Iowa and Wisconsin in terms of their rights to collective bargaining, which under state law they had been guaranteed as much as they can be guaranteed. And so some of the same issues are very much current today. I think that you know, voting rights, something as basic as voting rights. I mean, in the United States, compared to much of the world that I've been talking a lot about, voting at the municipal level was not, in principle, restricted in the way that it was in Sweden or in Germany particularly. In Sweden, in Malmö, Sweden, the owner of a local bank cast thousands of votes on behalf of himself and his interests. And workers in that community, in Malmö, in the 1890s, unless you had significant personal real estate property, you couldn't cast a vote at all. And even then, you might cast one vote. Well, against several thousand votes, that's not going very far. And in Germany, it was equally this case, the three-tier voting system, which was complicated in the Prussian states, but really highly restricted in terms of the impact that ordinary people and working people could have in local politics. But there were other ways in which, you know, voting was somewhat restricted in the United States. You know, there were a whole series of reforms that were instituted in the 1890s and early 20th century in American cities that required registration ahead of voting. It used to be that you show up at the polling place and you vote, right? And then you're identified and you get a mark on your hand and you voted, right? But eventually, under these new regulations, you had to go and register. If you were a working person, it might be, you know, it just made it more difficult to cast a vote than it had previously. So voting levels in cities plummet in the early 20th century as some of these rules come into effect, and it's just harder to vote. And you know, we're seeing that today, more dramatically in some states than others, but you know, it's still an issue. Yeah, but I think there are a lot of young people today who are really energized by making a difference in city politics and city governance, and I think that's pretty exciting to see that. So I hope this is a history that they find has some relevance and can learn something from.